Organic chemistry, folks, this is our new topic. Organic chemistry, the chemistry of carbon atoms. Now, if you remember, carbon is made up of 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. 2 electrons are going to be in the inner shell, and 4 electrons are going to be on the outer shell. Carbon, for it to become happy, it wants to get 4 more electrons. So when we deal with organic chemistry, we're dealing with carbon compounds. Now let's look at the formation of the carbon-based molecule. In the center you see a carbon atom, and you see that the carbon has formed the molecule methane. It has formed the molecule methane by bonding with 4 hydrogens. Now remember, each bond represents 2 electrons. 2 electrons to the left, right, forward, backward, and so on. In the formation of carbon molecules, you can form chains, as you can see, the carbon, the carbon, the carbon, forming a nice 3-carbon compound. You can form branch structures, as you can see. You get carbon to carbon to carbon, and in the middle, carbon, another line's formed that connects to carbon. Now remember, every line represents a covalent bond, a strong bond that ties that hydrogen to the carbon. Here we see a longer chain that's being formed. There's no limit to the type of Lego-like chains you can form with carbon to carbon to carbon bonding. Now here we're forming a ring structure. Now notice that in the ring structure, the octet rule is maintained. If I look at the top carbon, it is bonding to hydrogen with 2 electrons, to carbon to the left with 2 electrons, and now it forms 2 bonds with the carbon sharing 4 electrons. So 4 electrons on the 2 double bonds, 2 on the top, 2 on the left, gives us 8 electrons. Every time you see a carbon bonding to another carbon and forming a molecule, it will always form 8 electrons in terms of its covalent bonding. The octet rule must be maintained. Now, sometimes you see carbon compounds, like you're looking at this slide, having a variety of other atoms. Here we're looking at carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon, and there's an oxygen bridging 2 carbons to your on the top to your right. Now, this is basically a carbohydrate molecule. The carbohydrate molecule may be showing on the top, as you see, or it may be shown on the bottom in a little different format. Now, sometimes the carbon ring structure is shown in this fashion, where the carbon is not shown at all. As you can see, the carbon is missing off at each angle that's being formed. The carbon is not shown. So I just want you to understand that organic chemists have different ways of describing the same thing. Now, adding functional groups to a carbon chain. Carbons will will bind to carbon and so on, but there are different functional groups that you need to understand that are important in understanding macromolecules, which is where we're going with, which we are going towards in this discussion. Here we have 2 carbons combining to each other. Notice the first carbon is sharing 2 electrons with each hydrogen and 2 electrons with the other carbon, forming 8 electrons in this covalent bonding. The second is doing the same thing, but the second carbon is sharing 2 electrons with the OH, or the hydroxyl group. The hydroxyl group is now referred to as a functional group because it partakes in other chemical reactions when the timing is right. Here are important functional groups that you need to understand and memorize. Carboxyl group, hydroxyl group, the amino group, and the phosphate group. And you can see where each of these forms important bonding in the respective molecules. Now what we will be doing is building macromolecules. Now macro means large. The 4 major macromolecules are going to be carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. From monomers to polymers. All of your macromolecules are made up of building blocks. Monosaccharides, for example, are the building blocks of sugars to form polysaccharides. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins or polypeptides, as we will see later on. And nucleotides are the building blocks of DNA, nucleic acids, and so on. Carbohydrates, all of us are familiar with. We eat them every day. These are either monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides, and you're probably eating a bagel right now, so put it down and follow through with the rest of this stuff. Here we go. Monosaccharides. Monosaccharides, the building blocks of carbohydrates. Glucose is the major monosaccharides that we should be concerned with. Look at the ring structure of glucose to the left, and you can see that when you add 2 glucose together, they form a disaccharide called maltose. Therefore, glucose plus glucose gives you maltose plus water. This is a dehydration reaction. Notice what's happening is that glucose gets next to another glucose, and 2 functional groups called OH and OH, the hydroxyl group, get together and H2O splits out. Now this is a very common way of building macromolecules by way of dehydration reactions. Now notice that the reverse can also take place. You can take a disaccharide like maltose and break it down to get to monosaccharides. But in most of the reactions that we will be talking about, in the formation of macromolecules, we will be dealing with dehydration reactions. So polysaccharides are important in biology, as you can see. They make up starches, glycogen, cellulose, chitin, and so on. And for the most part, they're all made up of glucose, built together in various formations, as you can see, in various branches and various structures and so on. The next important macromolecule that we need to focus on is lipids. Now, lipids are built from the molecule glycerol plus fatty acids. Now, glycerol, as you can see, is a fairly simple molecule made up of 3 carbons and 1, 2, 3 functional hydroxyl group to your right. The fatty acids, however, are also fairly simple, but they can be extensively long. Look at this long chain of carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon and so on. But on the left side, there is a familiar carboxyl functional group. And as we said before, functional groups are going to be responsible for chemical reactions. So what happens in the formation of lipids, 1 glycerol molecule will combine with 3 fatty acids. And the combination takes place at the OH functional groups. And when this reaction occurs, 3 waters get split out, and the result is a triglyceride is formed with oxygen, oxygen, and oxygen bridging the carbon with the fatty acids. As you see, this molecule has a slightly charged polar head and a nonpolar tail. When we pour this lipid into water, what happens is that the hydrophilic side of the molecule, which is slightly charged, will be attracted towards the water. The hydrophobic side, which is not charged, will be pushed away from the water, forming this nice layer of lipid floating on top of water. And this concept is important to understand when we look at the structural formation of lipids. Now we'll look at some other types of lipids, saturated versus unsaturated fats. I'm looking at a lipid molecule that has fully saturated, the palmitic acid. And I'm looking at oleic acid, which is unsaturated. Now, by saturated versus unsaturated, we are saying a molecule is saturated when it is full of hydrogen bonding. You can see in illustration A, we are saturated with hydrogen. In illustration B, you can see a double bond is occurring, which means that hydrogen can be added to those bonds and they can be opened up. So saturated versus unsaturated is simply a measure of how much hydrogen is put into a given molecule. And this is why you've heard of saturated versus unsaturated fats. It is nothing more than changing the characteristics of fats by pumping more or less hydrogen into the particular substance. Now we'll look at another type of quote lipid structures, and these are quite complex. These are steroid compounds like testosterone, estrogen, and cholesterol. These molecules, again, are important in the formation of membranes of cells, and we will deal directly with these as time permits. And we will also look at hormones like testosterone and estrogen when we deal in the chapter on reproduction. So this slide gives a nice summary of carbohydrates and the various functions of carbohydrates, and fats and the various functions of fats. And I think you can look at these yourself and see how these things fall in place.